So today's webinar is going to be on database tuning and maintenance processes. My name is Mike Richardson. I'm the Director of Support for Cities Digital. Many of you have probably spoken with me in the past, and it's good to have you here. This is a really important webinar. It covers things that we've mentioned in the past but aren't necessarily covered under our support agreement, in that these are typical things that will happen on the back end on a SQL server with DBAs or whoever is managing SQL. So we really want to get this out here because it can significantly improve performance and also give you some really good guides on how to troubleshoot issues with SQL and the database. So the purpose of our training today is going to give you the information that you're going to need in order to utilize the tools within SQL to maintain the databases and keep them in top working order. Most of the information that's provided in this webinar has come directly from the EDM 208 class provided by Laserfiche at the last Laserfiche conference. They had a very comprehensive list of things to do, and so we took a lot of what they've already presented at the conference, mostly for the benefit of those who aren't able to attend the conference or who did attend the conference and maybe weren't able to get to this particular area of study. So the agenda for today is going to be why performing these tasks are important, limitations to implementation of these particular tasks, performance counters and general recommendations that we can use, database tuning and setup for maximum performance, monitoring performance, database maintenance, and of course the ever-present bonus inclusion of SQL backups and how to ensure that they're done correctly, which is always a question typically with folks who don't have a DBA or a really good knowledge of SQL in general. All right, so why performing SQL maintenance is important? Well, performance improvements are system-wide. So what we need to understand is that in the Laserfiche system, almost every action or event that occurs goes through SQL. So if you notice that SQL or Laserfiche is performing slowly or underperforming expectations, it can almost always go back to something within SQL. And that would either be that SQL is eating up all of the resources available on the SQL server, or that we're running a very, very intensive search within a workflow process multiple times, which is slowing down the system on the whole. Another area here is it will keep the database clean and defragmented, and then fragmentation of the indexes affect the entire system and lead to performance degradation. So we want to occasionally set up a maintenance plan, if possible, to go back and defragment some of these indexes that SQL uses and Laserfiche uses to perform its functions. These tasks can assist with keeping a clean maintenance schedule for other processes. So backing up can also be added to the system maintenance plans to provide a single source of maintaining the entire life cycle of the database. Let's see, consistency of performance and results. Things slow down and degrade over time if they're not maintained. Performing the SQL maintenance will ensure that you keep a consistent performance measure over time. Why performing SQL maintenance? Well, I think we went through this already. Next slide. Limitations to implementation. So some of the limitations to the implementation of maintenance plans and so on can be traced back to things like SQL Express. Laserfiche is sold in two different varieties, well actually three different varieties, one of which almost nobody uses, which is Oracle. And we're not, for the purpose of this particular endeavor, we're not going to discuss Oracle. If you have any questions about Oracle, you can let me know and I'll get them answered for you offline here. So SQL Express editions don't have the full range of tools that the full version of SQL has, with meaning it doesn't have the maintenance plans and all of that built into its design. There are newer versions of SQL that have come out recently, so I can't say that for sure on 2016 or whatever, but as far as going back to the normal SQL Express editions that we've used in the past, that is the case. Also, Laserfiche license limitations may only allow you to use SQL Express to be used, and you must know the version of licensing that you have. So it's pretty easy with the Avante and Rio licensing because it will have SQL Express at the end of your activation keys and or in the support page on the Laserfiche site, whereas with the older license modules, such as group or team installations, those are a little more difficult. Typically, United version of Laserfiche means that you're on the full version of SQL, whereas group or team means that you're limited to SQL Express. So it's important to know which one of those it is that you have if you don't know. The next piece to this is the processes can be run manually, which we're going to go over how to do here just a little bit later. So with SQL Express, you have a few options. You can use, I have a script that I put out on our FTP site that allows you to plug in your particulars about your server and set up the script to be run as a scheduled task, or you can run the process manually, literally by going in and right-clicking on the database and going to tasks and backup. Or there are online backup processes that we have. We sell the online backup software that allows this to happen in a way that's a best practice method. So if you're interested in that, you can let us know that too. The other limitation to implementation is a lack of knowledge about using maintenance plans. There are many firms who do not employ a DBA or don't have experience with administrating databases. I've included some links below in here, and if you look in the handouts section of the webinar here, this presentation is in PDF form, so if you need those links, you'll be able to get them from that PDF. So some of the general server recommendations are that you use a 64-bit database server and operating system. There are still quite a number of people out there that have a 32-bit server that might be a legacy server. They haven't had an opportunity to upgrade, so that's going to help improve performance. Also, using full versions of SQL or full versions of SQL should be on its own server instead of with the Laserfiche server and workflow server. Each one of these modules can be split out onto its own server. So if you're finding that you're having performance issues and your SQL server is on the same server as Laserfiche, that can be split off, and you're going to gain a pretty sizable performance impact from doing that. And that's going to be the very first recommendation that we have, is to split those off. Also, more RAM is better. So the more RAM that you have on the SQL server itself, that's better. And processor core speed is going to have a higher impact than more cores. So if you have an older server that's got a lower core speed on the processor, that's going to have a bigger impact than adding additional processors to the SQL server. So if we're splitting that off and you have the opportunity to put SQL on a host that has a higher gigahertz speed on its cores, then that'll definitely help. It's also extremely difficult to tell what kind of hardware you'll need for your server. So if you've ever asked by pre-sales for advice about hardware specs, you run into this. The best we can do is offer advice and guidelines, and it, take some testing and building from there. But there are some just general recommendations. The temp tables for search are on disk. So if you've got a lot of searches going on, with workflow or anything else, then it's going to be better to have higher disk speeds on the SQL server. More rotations per minute and whatever is going to help with those searches. SQL 2014 memory table business, you can mark the tables to be kept in memory. We don't take advantage of it in Laserfiche. The tables aren't built to leverage this. The search tables get written to and wiped frequently. The reason why they don't incorporate this into the Laserfiche product is that they would need to make large changes to take advantage of it, and you'd need literally 2 to 3 times as much RAM as your biggest repository, which would be ridiculous amounts of RAM for most people. All right. Going to disk layouts. So the optimal disk layout for this is going to be to split up databases over multiple arrays, with arrays meaning multiple disks or spindles. So if you have multiple RAID arrays, it's best that you can split this up. If this is for like very large SQL instances for Laserfiche. If you have, a couple hundred gigabytes worth of data, this is really not going to apply unless you are performing a lot of automated tasks. So RAID 1 is an exact copy of data over 2 disks. RAID 10 is a stripe of mirrors, striping for performance and then mirrored for safety. The best performance output next to RAID 0 is going to be RAID 10. And then you'd want to use, if possible, a separate array for your TempDB database on RAID 0, which will give it a better performance. Now, TempDB database is a Microsoft database. It's not having anything to do with Laserfiche, but it will improve the performance of SQL overall. Now, just keep in mind, this is like the best layout you can get. So this doesn't mean that you have to have this. What it's saying is that if you're having trouble with SQL or slow performance, these are going to be the next steps after splitting SQL off onto another machine to help improve the performance, in addition to the maintenance plans that we're going to get to. So on the disk layout, this is continued over here. So the price versus performance is always something that comes up. You can get very expensive when you're laying out disk specifications for a server. So the SSD arrays, if you don't know what SSDs are, they're solid state drives. They're like RAM sort of. They perform at much higher level than standard traditional disks, hard drives, but they're also very expensive, although they're coming down recently. But in any event, the best way to utilize an SSD array would be for the TempDB, but not for the Laserfiche databases. The TempDB is the one that is constantly changing, but the Laserfiche databases are not changing nearly as fast and therefore don't need the performance that the TempDB does. The order of priorities to get a better performance impact from SQL would be to separate the operating system from the database file, and then to separate the database and transaction log, and then to separate the TempDB database, and then to have multiple data files. So these are kind of the order of what's going to give me my best bang for my buck if I decide to do this and I'm having issues with SQL or slowness in Laserfiche, but I don't want to go all out and do all these separations, all these arrays, all this expense. These would be the items in order that we would want to proceed through to boost the performance until you get to a level that works for you. All right, moving on. So this is a disk layout diagram of the various arrays that you can use for Laserfiche and the databases. So ideally what you would have is that you'd have a RAID 1 array on C, which contains the OS and the Laserfiche installation files. Then we'd have a RAID 0 on F that contains the TempDB and log files. And then on the E drive, which is a RAID 1, we'd have transaction logs for the databases. And then, of course, on RAID 10, which might be a G drive, we'd have the actual database files themselves. Again, this is not something you have to do. This is if you're having performance issues with SQL and Laserfiche. These are the ideal settings for boosting performance. And of course, like I said, this is the ideal scenario for maximum performance and protection. It's not an absolute necessity that this be done this way. All right, I'm going to move on to the next one, which is database virtualization. So I get the question quite frequently, can we virtualize SQL? And the answer is you can, of course, but the best practice method is that the database should be on a physical server if possible. Obviously, that could be a very expensive proposition, but if you have a very large system spanning your entire company and Laserfiche is a critical application, it very well may be worth the expense to do this. But if you do choose to virtualize, these are the things that can help maintain performance, which is to allocate static RAM and CPU cores so that they're not switching over between VMs as the need arises. We'd want to have static resources for SQL if you do virtualize it. Use separate physical disks and arrays for the database and the transaction logs. So if on the VM you have two different arrays that can be given to the VM, then that would be ideal to put the database on one of the arrays and the transaction logs for the database on the other array. And always be careful with backups. There is I did a webinar on backups, not recently, but it's out there on our FTP site. So if you do go to our FTP site, which is ftp://ftp.citiesdigital.com, and then there's a DL, which stands for downloads, and then LF, which stands for Laserfiche. There's a folder inside there called Webinar Docs, and it contains all of the PDFs for all of the webinars that I've done in the past, one of them being backups. So we're going to touch on SQL backups, but for best practice purposes, that's a pretty lengthy discussion, and you might want to read through that particular document for the webinar to get more detailed information on backing up the Laserfiche system on the whole rather than just SQL. Okay, so now we're getting into performance monitoring, which is a little bit of a separate issue from what we were talking about. The first half of this, or the first part of this webinar that I just got finished with, is actually more about maintaining performance with SQL and Laserfiche, whereas this is going to go more into how do I monitor and know if there are issues with SQL. Okay, so performance monitoring strategies include establishing a baseline for system behavior, because you need a controlled method of knowing, okay, where's my baseline at versus where do I need to be, or versus where is the system at with regards to that baseline. So if you have a baseline that you took this year and then later this year you run some more of these statistics and they show that there's a marked improvement or a marked decrease in SQL performance, then we can start using some more of the detailed counters to look at where that decrease might be coming from. We want to identify trends and establish goals. Where do we want to be? Where are we at where we want to be? Pinpoint and remove bottlenecks, hopefully before someone complains. And of course, we're going to repeat this process, you know, probably once a year, once every other year, or when necessary. So regardless if you're looking to project what kind of hardware you're going to need to increase the number of users in your system or figure out where the pesky slowdown's coming from, this process of performance monitoring is the same in that case, performance analysis time. So when I say performance analysis, what I'm talking about is the gathering and analysis of data to help figure out what the problem is or what's going on. So here's our strategy. We're going to get some baseline data, identify the trends, establish the goals, and get rid of the bottlenecks. And then we're going to do it again. So basically what I just kind of went over here, as you can see. The first step is incredibly important. By recording your data over a period of time, you'll be able to see the trends and changes in performance. A small increase in memory usage taken out of context isn't a big deal, but a steady increasing amount of memory found by looking at a larger set, that might be something that we need to take a look at and address. Using the trends, you can identify issues long before you have people, you know, coming to you and saying that there's a problem. Additionally, it's always important to have a cold, hard data to show people, you know, who might hold the purse strings, if you will, when you're ready to purchase new hardware, so you can actually justify the need to do that. So there's several data collection methods here, and we're going to concentrate on the most important pieces of that, one of which is perfmon. If you've never heard of this, it's a Windows process that you have available to you. It literally stands for Performance Monitor. You can set up different, what they call counters, and these counters will monitor that particular function and what's going on there. So in this example on the screen here, you have processor time, you know, is scaled up here at the top in the black. And then you also have the processor queue length, which is down toward the bottom, and it's showing how each of these are being used on this particular server. So we just want to make sure that we have the right counters, that we're logging the right counters for performance, and I'm going to go over those counters. and you should automate the data collection by setting up data collectors in perfmon.exe and automatically starting and stopping them for your test. So what you don't really want to do is utilize perfmon, have it on continuously gathering detailed logs about this over a period of, a year or something. It's going to eat up a lot of disk space. So we want to turn these on, establish our baseline, and then kind of turn them off for a while until we want to notice what it is that might be happening at that period of time compared to the baseline. Performance counters are usually problem indicators. To solve a problem, you might need to add hardware, optimize the code, or change the configuration to get additional, profiling or different types of traces. So to add a data collector, you're going to open perfmon, which is literally perfmon.exe. I'm not exactly sure where it's located, but you can click start and then type in perfmon. It should come up for you. Once you've started the performance monitors, you can go into the data collector sets here and start adding counters or system sets here. So you'd create a new collector set, and then it's going to be a performance counter alert. And then you just click finish. It's that easy. And then we'll start adding the actual counters that we want to be included here. So we're going to add these counters over here once that's done, and there's a whole bunch of them. And in just a minute, I'm going to give you the ones that we really want to kind of look at as a part of these counters. So, for instance, this one here that's highlighted in this screenshot is the average disk per second read on the read side of things. So it's reading from the disk. You can tell how much is being read from the disk. There's also a write and a queue length and different things. All right, so the performance monitor counters that we're going to want to use here. Let's see, the most important performance analysis data that you can get are the Windows performance counters. These counters provide detailed information on a wide array of system and application metrics. For the purpose of our analysis, with this particular analysis, we're going to be using, we're going to be separating them in three categories: system counters, product counters, and informational counters. All right, so system counters provide you with information on the system resources used on a particular machine, like CPU, memory, etc. Product counters are Laserfiche counters that provide you with detailed information about Laserfiche activities, such as documents created, workflow, throughput, and so on and so forth. Informational counters are those that provide you with the context regarding activity on the repository, such as session counts, user licenses used, and so on and so forth. Here are some of the system counters that we might want to utilize here. So here are some of the things that we want to watch. The processor time. This one is the time that the processor spends doing productive tasks. It's doing things. Your processor is made to do things. We're only concerned about sustained issues, not spikes. If your proc queue length is short, then you just need to be able to handle more threads at once. You need more cores is basically what that's saying. If the processor queue length is too long, then you're not processing fast enough, and we need faster type cores. So, I mean, that's just one instance of it. The processor queue length is how many threads that are waiting to be processed. 4 is a general recommendation, although some will argue that anything above 2 is a red flag. There are a number of reasons why this might happen. It could be a slow processor, could be a background task like certain backup procedures, or it could be other applications running in the background, something like remoting into the DBMS server. You need historical data to figure out what's going on with this one. So that's the baseline that we're going to need. The available megabytes is how much memory is left. And pages per second is how many times a page must be read from or written to a disk due to a hard page fault, not in memory, written to disk. This is normal. In fact, this will never be 0. More memory means less paging, though, and too much of this indicates SQL Server doesn't have all the memory that it needs. Again, you might want to watch for other things running or complex tasks such as backups, imports, exports. And of course, all of these metrics are assuming that Laserfiche is on its own server. If you have Laserfiche on a server with other applications like Exchange, it's going to kind of blow this out of the water. I mean, it's because Exchange is going to be using these counters too, and so you're just going to have to define a baseline at that point and see where you're at when it's working properly, and then maybe go back and look at it a little bit later to see if it's changed for the worse. All right, so there are SQL specific counters too. Full scans come up a whole bunch in the research, but that's one of those counters that you won't be able to do much about. The full scans per second measures the number of times data is retrieved by scanning through the database versus indexes. There's nothing much you can do about it. You'll want to talk to development or support if you're having problems with it. But these are SQL specific counters that will give you more insight into how SQL's performing. So as you can see, there's different categories here. One for databases, the buffer manager, another buffer manager, and access methods. And those counters will be the ones that are listed here. And you can see the red flag metrics and what it might indicate. So for databases, it might be the potential bottlenecks for the transaction log, which might mean that you need to split the transaction log off onto its own array. For the buffer manager, it could point to a memory issue not having enough, or that it's not performing well. The other buffer also could point to a memory issue. And then if the access methods are out of whack here according to the red flag, then we might need to talk to development, which means that you could create a case with us and we'll create one with Laserfiche and see if there's anything that we can do. Again, please keep in mind this is all assuming that Laserfiche is on its own server and SQL is on its own server. If that's not the case, these metrics might be different for you. Okay, so for database maintenance, one of the things that we want to do on the maintenance side of things to keep things moving the way that it's supposed to be moving is to defragment or reorganize or rebuild fragmented indexes. Fragmentation of the indexes can significantly impact the performance of Laserfiche. And just imagine for a second that your database index is a phone book organized by last name, right? So as the city grows, new people have to be registered in the phone book. So being somewhat clever phone book designers, they've left space in the pages to allow for new people to be added in. Since it's a bound book, if you run out of space on your page, you can't just stick in new pages. You have to append them to the back of the book. So this disorganization makes it harder to find what you're looking for, what Laserfiche is looking for. So there are ways to defragment the database, and we're going to cover those here in just a minute. But the tables that you need to be aware of when you're looking to set up the maintenance plan to rebuild those fragmented or reorganize those databases are these three tables right here. They're the most popularly used tables in the database. Will be the doc table within the Laserfiche database, and that is how many pages are stored in the volumes. And then the talk pages are how Laserfiche entries are stored, and the prop val index field contains all of the field data. So if you're setting up a maintenance plan just as a basic maintenance plan to assist with getting things back and reorganized, those are going to be the three that you'd want to set up in your maintenance plans to be done at certain intervals. If you are a high-end user of Laserfiche, meaning that you use it constantly and it's got a lot of workflows and activity going on, then perhaps we'd want to do this maybe once a week. If you are not using Laserfiche quite as much, maybe once a month. And you know, if you don't use it very heavily on the workflow or forms or anything side of things, I don't know, maybe once a quarter would be a good idea. And then you need to check those. If you do an upgrade, we need to go back and check that those indexes, the maintenance plans and everything are still in place. So we're going to continue with database maintenance, and one of the things that we're going to concentrate on is backing up the database. So just be sure that you're backing up the database correctly. Yes, there is a definite way to back up correctly for SQL, and that's covered in my other webinar in detail if you really want to look at that, but let's concentrate on this right here for now. The proper backups are not like backing up files. So I have that link in this document here that goes back to what I discussed when backing up the Laserfiche system. SQL has two things for a database. There's a database file, which is popularly known with the extension of MDF, and then there's a transaction log that logs the transactions that are happening in the database. If you just back up those two files, they're not constantly in sync, like millisecond to millisecond. If you just back them up and then try to restore them later, you very well could end up with a corrupt backup, which won't be able to be restored. And at that point, if you can't restore SQL, the entire system is gone. I mean, there's not much you can do if you have a corrupt database. Just remember what I said in the beginning, that SQL holds pretty much all of the information about documents, field identifiers, the location of the volumes, login credentials, everything is stored in SQL, so it's very critical that we back this up properly. You also want to make sure that you check your backups. This is something that I've been seeing a little bit of a problem with over the course of the last year or so with some of our users, is that they have a method for backing up, but it's just assumed that it's working. And then so when we go in and kind of check things, it's not performing exactly as it should, or it's skipping backups, or they ran out of disk space and nobody noticed, and there's not alerts set up or anything else. So it does behoove you to go in there, I don't know, maybe once a quarter, set an appointment up in your Outlook calendar or something, just to check on the process to make sure that it's actually backing up properly and not just failing over and over and over and no one knows. That actually happened one time, and it wasn't fun. We did manage to save a significant portion of their database, but it was a lot of work and a lot of expense. Okay, so this next thing comes from Laserfiche, and so I'm just going to read you exactly what they say about it, because I think what they say about it is kind of not only funny, but maybe gives you something to think about. So some DBAs will disagree vehemently with me on this. In doing research, I came across all sorts of opinions on these. So what he's going to talk about is a handful of suggestions, and one of them is update statistics. So the transaction logs can grow unruly over time. If you're operating under a simple recovery model, and I'll talk about that here in just a second, you won't need to worry about this. But the full recovery model doesn't clean up the LFD file unless you're back up the transaction log separately using backup log. Shrinking the transaction logs pulls out unused space, making them smaller and easier to back up. Note that shrinking the log files takes time and resources to do, writes a bunch of changes to the log file, and can result in immediate grow operations if more space is needed. So basically, I've seen this too in the past, and what happens is if you're using a backup method that doesn't back up the transaction logs of the database directly, then it just continues to grow. If you're in the full backup mode, there are two modes really that you can find in the options for your database. One of them is a simple recovery method, and the other is the full recovery method. So the full recovery method allows you to roll back to a point in time, and that's why it grows the transaction log so much. So if I wanted to roll back to 1 p.m. Last Thursday for SQL, I could do that if I have the full recovery mode set. If I'm in simple mode, basically all that's saying is I got the backups, don't worry about it, but don't grow that transaction log a lot, significantly. I manage the backups and I know that they're good. So for most people, it's set to simple because that transaction log, when you're backing up, it might be backing up using a third-party software which does not do that backup process on the transaction log itself and thus shrink it, so it just grows ever larger. I've actually seen one that got to be about 500 gigabytes over the course of a few years, so it ate up all of their disk space, and we literally ran or put it into simple mode and then shrunk the database, and boom, you got 500 gigabytes worth of space back. And he had no need for full recovery because the system has to be in a symbiotic mode of being backed up simultaneously or close to simultaneously anyway. Rolling the database back to 1 o'clock in the afternoon on Friday and then subsequently restoring the volume files that were backed up at 5 a.m. the previous day. It's all out of sync now, so you'd have entries in SQL that don't exist in the volumes. So the reality of it is almost no one needs to roll back to a specific time unless you're also matching that backup of the volume files in real time too. But you might want to check your log files if you haven't in a while and just see how big they are, or if you're set to full or simple mode. And the last database maintenance item here is to shrink the transaction, or shrink the transaction log only as needed. So you don't want to go in there and just shrink the transaction log for no reason. If you have it set to simple mode, you shouldn't have to worry about this at all. But if you're in full mode and you're not backing up the transaction logs so that it's ever growing larger and larger, and you don't really need that, then just shrink the transaction log only when you really need to. Don't do that all the time. All right, so just a little bit more on the database maintenance side. It's probably best if you add this as a part of your backup routine if you are using Laserfiche really heavily. I don't know that I would add anything more than maybe rebuilding indexes as a part of the backup routine, and I don't even know if I'd do it then because it would happen every night, and I don't know if that's really necessary. Typically once a week for pretty heavy use is gonna make a big impact for you. Anything more than that is probably wasted time. But if you want to set it up and just have backups and maintenance happening all at the same time, then I guess you can't go wrong with that, because it's just going to perform everything at once, and you can check just one node of the maintenance plans just to make sure that it's running every night, instead of having a couple of different plans, one for the maintenance and one for the backups. So that's really up to you. You can also consider using an automated solution. There are like scheduled scripts, like I said before. If you go to that document that I referenced earlier, with my webinar on backups, I have a link out to the area on our FTP site where I have the scripts for backing up SQL Express and then setting a task scheduler. I've written it out in such a way that pretty much anybody should be able to follow those directions. Again, we don't necessarily set up backups for customers, and there's a liability issue there, because if we do it and for whatever reason it's not monitored, or something changes later on down the road and it's not working, then since we set it up, we're liable. So we really try to stay out of the backup part of this, but want to give you the information that you need to be able to do that. And certainly we're here for any questions or concerns, because it is something that I really want to make sure happens correctly. There are also MS SQL maintenance plans. So if you have the full version of SQL and not Express, you have the ability to set up maintenance plans that will perform these functions for you. I encourage that. I don't see a lot of it, which is kind of disheartening in some ways. This is another reason why we're doing this webinar, is because to put that out there and get that information out. But you have to also know that maintenance plans are not an option in SQL Express. Because SQL Express is the free version of SQL, and they're not going to give you all that stuff. So if you have any need to back up SQL Express, there are other options for that using third-party tools. We even have a backup service that we provide. We didn't really want to get into that business, but it became necessary because some of our smaller clients don't have the means or don't want to spend the money on third-party software for themselves to monitor, so we do offer that as a service. If you want to sign up for something like that, you can just let us know and we'll be glad to get you more information. All right, so there's other databases to manage too in addition to just Laserfiche. I mean, there are workflow, forms, audit trail, the directory server, all of those things have databases to them. They don't have specific, or I don't have information on specific tables for organization within workflow, forms, and all of that. If you want to know more about that, I can look it up for you, or we can get you pointed in the right direction. But for the purposes of this particular webinar, I couldn't find any, like, okay, here's a specific index, re-index that index. I didn't find any of that. So Of course, I didn't dig extraordinarily deep, but I'm sure if it's out there, I will find it for you. If you want to know, just let me know. So another thing that we want to do is to disable the auto shrinking of the database. So you can go to add in your maintenance task there, auto shrink false under this config.xml file. So if you want to disable the auto shrinking of the database, it has been recommended. You can go in there, like I said, in the config.xml file, and within that that area, add what you see here, maintenance auto shrink equal false, and that'll stop auto shrinking. So let's see, I've got some notes here from Laserfiche. Audit trail standard maintenance practices apply. Audit trail on the database can be very SQL intensive. Depending on how much data is kept for reporting and repository activity, it can have a negative impact on database performance depending on how it's used. And I put this in my notes because I wanted to touch on that. That's another thing that I see quite frequently, is that for audit trail, people will put in that they want to keep 365 days of history to be able to report on. That's not really a good idea, and I'll explain why. What happens is auditing takes place in the background and writes to text files, which are called log files, in the audit folder under where your repository is at. When you set up audit trail, you say I want to look up 365 days of activity. It literally pulls from those text log files and puts them into a SQL database and maintains that over there. So if you've got 365 days of every time someone's logged in or out of the system, and you've got a large system, you can imagine that's going to be a lot of data that's going to be translated into a SQL database. Why is that a bad thing? Well, because there's a lot of activity constantly writing up to that database, which will impact the other databases that are on there. So you have workflow, you have Laserfiche, you have forms. You don't want to write a bunch of things to the audit trail database and have it negatively impact the performance of Laserfiche and forms and workflow, and for 365 days worth of data that you're probably never going to use, right? I mean, let's say we run an audit trail report twice a year. So we're maintaining all of this data and impacting negatively our performance for everything else for those 2 searches per year. What you can do is set it for 60 days, and then if you need a custom date range in there, at the time that you need to run the report, you go back in and add that specific date range in there, let it pull in, and then when you're done with your report, you can remove it, and it'll empty it out of the database, and then we won't have any negative impacts on the rest of the databases. The advice that Laserfiche would give is use audit trail on the same server as Laserfiche workflow databases, but if it impacts performance, you might want to move it to its own database or SQL instance. Right, yeah, okay. Again, if you just keep the 60-day history in there, you really won't need to have another SQL database instance, which most people don't have enterprise licenses for and can't just stand one up, and it'd be a pretty terrible expense to go through for audit trail. The LF directory server database, which is a Rio database, is tiny and doesn't need anything. On the audit trail, whatever indexes are there, it says rebuild the indexes is what it says. It doesn't tell me which indexes in the notes here, but and change the backup mode to simple on the audit trail database. And why would you do that if you have full on everything else? As I mentioned, that audit trail database pulls information from the log files and populates the SQL database. So literally, at any time we want to get rid of it, we can wipe the audit trail database, go back to the configuration, recreate it, and let it start pulling again so that we have a fresh copy of it. That audit trail database is not critical to backups or anything else because it can be recreated at any time from those log files. You also want to disable the shrinking of the database in accordance with this this key here in the config.xml file is their recommendation. We're getting close to being done. All right, so we're down to the bonus here, and backing up the SQL database properly. One of my favorite topics. As I mentioned earlier on, you can't just back up the SQL database. You have to do it, in a certain way. So there are multiple ways that you can do this. The SQL database is backed up differently than the normal file, as the heading says there. You can use a third-party backup software that has a SQL agent, right, like Veritas or whatever, backup exec with a SQL agent. That agent was designed specifically to back up live SQL databases, and you can't just back up the files using the normal backup exec. You can use SQL to automate the backups to a .bak file that then can be backed up using normal backup software without an agent. So those maintenance plans that I talked about, and if you right-click on the database and go to tasks and backup and set it to, lf.bak, that file is a combination of the transaction log and everything together in a way that SQL is okay with, and then you can just back up the .bak file to using Mozy Pro or copy, paste, whatever it is you want to use for your normal backup methods. Which again, the volume is not a part of this. So the volume is just the series of files that's stored there. So you don't have to do anything special with that, but you do with SQL. You can also back it up manually or even use a SQL script along with the task scheduler to automate the backups for SQL Express. Again, that goes back to the line item above talking about the .bak file. So using the script, that script is basically an automation of a script that was written in SQL language to create the .bak file, and then you use task scheduler to execute that script on a certain basis, and it will create that .bak file, which then you can use whatever to back it up with. Again, I put my backup webinar PDF out there in this link. If you want to read more about that, I would definitely encourage you. It's a pretty lengthy document, covers a lot of scenarios, but it's a good read. And backing up is very important to the overall system. So now we're at the end of this. As always, there's my email address on the screen there. If you need if you have any additional questions or you need any additional resources, feel free to reach out.